Hello everyone, my name is Dylan Young. I am going to be covering a topic on Sitecore Docker and using it inside a solution file. So this kind of is a carry-on to my last session I did on how to set up the Sitecore Docker Images. And so this will now talk about how to take those Docker images that we've created and create and move those compose files that we're using into our Sitecore solution file. So this is going to talk about a new instance I'm going to be spinning up. So I'm going to be spinning up a new instance of those Docker images into containers, and I'm also going to be creating a new solution for this. I may do a video in the future where I take an existing solution and I just add Docker support to it, but the process is relatively the same, and I'll talk about that while I'm doing this video. So to get started, what I'm going to want to do is I am going to want to go to my command prompt, and I'm going to basically want to clone my Git repository that I've created in my GitHub account. So I've just created it. It's a simple one, and then I'm going to basically add and deploy those changes to that GitHub. So to do that, I'll just do a git clone of that repository. Let me just check what it is right quick. And then essentially I will clone that, and that will create it locally. So now in my development folder, I now have this Docker training, and it basically right now just contains a readme.md. So I'm going to go through the process of creating the various assets and things I need to create a solution. A simple project that will represent our project layer of an example site. And I may create a few other foundation level projects or modules for this as well. So let's go through this process. So I have this. The next part I want to go through is I want to kind of link or go over to Visual Studio. And I'm just going to create a new Visual Studio 2019. I kind of open up a new window with that and get it open, and then I'm going to basically create a new solution. I'm going to create a blank empty solution to start, and then I'm going to slowly add things to it. So now that we're open here, I am going to do create new project, and I'm using Visual Studio 2019. So the interface for this is slightly different in 2017, but the overall process is the same. So I'm going to select blank solution, double click on that, and then I'm just going to call this Docker training. And then I'm just going to specify a path for this. So I'm going to go back up into my C drive, if I can find it, and then my development folder, and then I'm going to open up my Sitecore Docker training and click select. And then I am just going to, it's a little hard to see there, press create. And when this first creates it in a location that I don't really want. I don't want this Docker training folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy or cut this out. Really, I need to close this as well. And then I'm going to go back. I'm going to paste this into the main root of the folder. It's all about getting the right folder structure that you want. So what I really want is the solution in the root, and then I want some source folders that represent the code that I'm going to be doing. And then you might have some other folders in the root that represent some of the configuration and things that you might be doing. You're also going to have some files that also are present in the root as well. And those are going to be ones for Docker, and there's going to be ones for, git ignore, things like that. So now that I have that, I'm going to try to open this again. I don't think I need to make any changes to this. So I'm just going to click Visual Studio 2019 and wait for that to load. And there it goes. So now I can shrink this down, and essentially we have a blank solution here. And now we can start getting things set up. So the first few things I'm going to do is kind of the overall structure of my solution. I typically want some solution folders created. One I typically have is configuration. This could contain my DockerCompose file. This could contain overall configuration. If you have any sort of configuration that you're going to want in your document, in your solution configuration, such as maybe some targets, definitions, maybe some build configurations, whatever it may be, I typically sit in the configuration. And then obviously with a Helix solution, I want foundation, and then I want feature,
and then I want project. All right, so I have this, and now what I want to do is I want to create so I'm going to do an add. I'm going to basically create a new project. This is going to be an MVC project. And to do that, I'll just do new project. And we're going to select an ASP.NET Web Application.NET Framework. So we'll double click that. And we will call this. Now, this is kind of a Helix guideline that I'm going to follow. But so I'm going to basically call this just website, which is a little weird of a name. And then we're going to go and do location. And this is what I was talking about. We're going to create a new source. And you can call this abbreviation, or you can just give it a full path or full name. Into source, since we're creating a project, or project level, a module, we're going to create a new folder here called project. And then we're going to go inside this, and then I'm going to just call it that. And then, yes, so one more folder. And I'm going to call this demo. So this represents demos or demonstrations or anything I'm going to be working on that I need to have front end representations of the kind of the modules I'll be defining. I'll do select, and then I'll make sure it's 4.7.2 is selected. Just to clarify, I'll be doing this Docker stuff with 9.3. So in my previous video I did on Docker, I did 9.2, but I think it's important that to always use the latest version, especially when doing training purposes. And then when you're defining your MVC project, it's important to always select empty and then select MVC. If you do it the reverse way, you get a bunch of dependencies that you don't necessarily need. I always seem to click configure for HTTPS. It doesn't really matter. You can check it or you don't. I'll just not check it for this time. And then I will just do create. I could set up unit tests as well if I wanted to. And at some point in the future, I'll talk about unit tests in my series as well. So now I have this website defined. So the next thing I need to do is actually go and into the properties. I'm actually not going to leave it with that name. It needs to be a fully qualified name for this solution. So I will just call it, let's just call this training.project.demo. And I probably should just copy it so that I don't have to type this in each time, but I'm a fast typer, so I don't typically always worry about it. And then I'm going to save those changes and close out. And then I'm going to also rename this. And this, if you've watched some of my videos in the past, this is a similar process I go through. In the past, I've called it code, and now I call it website. It's just a convention that's defined in the new Helix guidelines that have been updated recently. So I kind of typically follow what is kind of best practice. So I delete this. I'm going to delete some of this stuff because I don't need all this in my basic solution. I might need an app config and things like that. A few other things is I need to make sure that these are not set to publish because I don't want it to publish those files. So just bear with me as I go ahead and just create a few more projects, and I'll just keep it recording. That way you can watch me go through this process. Properties, and I'm going to select this as none. And that's pretty much it. So I have this. I'm not going to do anything with it for now. So the next thing is I want to just create some simple views here. I really just want to create a layout. New folder, and I just want to call this demo to kind of represent the layout used for the demo. And I am going to give this a partial view, and I will just call this main layout. Or actually just call it layout. And so this is ready to go. I can just create some simple HTML structure here. And so
like that. Now we want to kind of get this into our Sitecore solution. That's the next thing. So what we have right now, it's not connected to a Sitecore solution at all. So let's go through the next steps of this. So the first thing I want to do before I jump in too far is I want to go to my Team Explorer, and I want to go to Changes, and I'm going to see all the changes I've been making. The first thing is I want to kind of ignore some of this stuff, and I'm going to actually, it's going to make changes to the get ignore stuff. I'm going to make further changes to that file. Just let me go through here real quick and ignore certain things. Ignore, I think that is all that I basically want to ignore in this file. I preferably also want to ignore all .user files. So ignore .user extensions. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So if I open this up real quick, it's actually missing some things I just added to it. Let me just check. Let me check in my stage. Okay, ignore changes. And so some options I have here is, let's just go ahead and you can star stuff. So make it, this wouldn't necessarily exclude those folders if you were, let's just remove that as well. So if you save it, now it shows that nothing much has changed. Let's just stage that as well. And so I will changes to get ignore. Because there's a lot of files that your solution is going to create by default that you don't want to check in. They're either local environment specific to your development that you don't want to check in so that all your other developers on your team has those same files. You don't want to do that. And then there's a lot of other things that are created that you don't want to share. So really the first thing that I always like to do when I set up a new solution is to set up and make sure my get ignore is pretty kind of flexible. So these configurations I've made it so that if I create any modules that have a website in a bin folder, it will ignore it by default. This doesn't necessarily protect against if you have like an Xconnect and then the bin folder, it would still add it. So then I might add additional rules, or I could have removed all of this and then just had */bin, and then it would have removed everything that's has a bin folder in it. But I want to be protective against scenarios where it might ignore something that I really do want it to check in. And I just add comments to it. So now I'm going to just check this in. Initial project demo module commit. So it just describes that I'm essentially checking in this demo website that I just created. So I'm going to commit it, and I'll just go ahead and sync these up real quick. So if I do a push, so as you can see, all the stuff that we just worked on is now present in my public repo, which you guys can, I'll definitely link to in the description below, that you guys can use for references. A couple things I might do during this process is I might add, for example, I might add an existing item to this configuration, and I would just add the README. So if I wanted quick access to this README file so that I can make changes to it. So that's something I could do there. Okay, let's just say now we've got a solution set up. Now we want to start testing it against a Sitecore instance. So there's a lot of different ways that we could do this. In the old ways, before Docker, you would set up a 9.3 instance on your local machine and then have to go through this whole process of using SIF to install it, making sure you have Solar, making sure you have SQL, things like that. All that now should be a lot easier because you will now use Docker instead. So there's a few things that we're going to need to do. The first thing that is important and really easy to do, really, is we're going to actually go back to those Sitecore Docker Images folder that we had before. So let's go to, I think it's under Docker, Sitecore
Docker Images, and we are going to open Windows Tests 9.3. And what we're going to do is, since we're doing this against, really we're going to do this against one version always, what we can do is we can actually just copy this. We'll copy this and we'll just move it to that folder that we have that represents this development that we're doing. So Sitecore Docker Training. And we can just paste it here into the root. So let's open up this document and also in the process add it to the configuration. So DockerCompose. One thing I want to do is I want to rename this. So I'm just going to call this DockerCompose.yaml instead. The reason we're doing this is that we're always going to test against the same version, the same type of Sitecore instance, things like that. If you wanted to run a 9.3 instance where you test against an XM versus an XP versus maybe an XC instance, you could theoretically have a bunch of DockerCompose files in here. You could test also against multiple versions if you wanted to, but one caveat to that I would have is that your projects, your modules themselves are going to reference Sitecore, and they're going to reference Nougat packages that are a specific version. So if you were to Docker Compose a 9.2 containers for Sitecore, and then you had references to 9.3, you would obviously have to go through the process of kind of changing those versions so you could test appropriately. We're going to look in here real quick. And so this is the definition of what instances, or essentially what images are going to be built to build into Sitecore Docker containers. What this is going to do is this is going to basically do a SQL container. And this container is using an image that we already have defined. And this is essentially if we're going to use a 9.3 instance. Oh, one other thing that we need to move over as well from that other folder is actually the environment file. So let me do that real quick. Is we want this environment file before I forget. So let's go back forward. And we're just going to paste this here. That's what's going to populate these variables that you see defined here. So if we were to also do and you don't necessarily need an environment file. What you could do is just come in here and change all these values to be exactly what you're looking for, and then you don't necessarily need an environment file. Let's say you have several versions of the type of Sitecore instance, like an XM, an XP, an XC, etc. And you want to update that to from a 9.2 to a 9.3, and you want to do testing. Doing an environment file might be a little easier because all you need to do is make the changes in one spot. It's just an FYI. So if you're just doing one version and you only ever plan on doing one version, and you're only testing one environment, and you only have one Docker Compose file, it might make sense to just get rid of the environment file and go from there. So let's just add existing item, and I'm just going to add that environment file. And so you essentially see here you have your registry with your different versions that it's going to use. We have a Sitecore version, which we're going to keep at 9.3. We have our Sitecore license, and we have some SQL SA password. We also have Telerik encryption. Let's just populate this to be our license.xml. So that's that. So we can close that out, and now it's just going to be pulled in when we run a Docker Compose, and we're using this Docker Compose YAML file. It's just going to pull in those variables right into this script essentially. So back to this file. Essentially, we're telling it we're going to spin up an image. It's going to use images from what we already have defined. So you can't just start with this video and start running Docker right off the bat. You have to go back and watch my video on how to get started with Sitecore Docker Images, because you have to create the images on your local machine or using a remote repository, which I'll do a video in the future on that as well. But you have to be set up and ready to go to run those basically turn an image into a container. And to see our images, we can just do Docker image slash or space ls, and essentially these are all my images that are running on my local machine, and you can see I have images for 9.2 and 9.3. Some other information in this file that is useful and in this definition for the SQL instance is the volumes. The volumes is a local folder. It's kind of like a mapping between your Docker Images drive and your local drive. And it kind of creates this connection point there. So there is going to be a .data, and we'll need to actually move this folder over from our Docker definition. We'll need to move this over so that these files will come in as well. The mem limits is just the size of this SQL container. Ports is useful for, and I haven't done a video on this yet, but how you can connect to your Docker container when it's running. So once it's running, you can actually spin up a SQL Server Express Studio or whatever tool you have to connect to your SQL instance, and you can actually connect to it, and you would just be using localhost, and then you'd use port 44010, and then that essentially maps to the SQL Server port of 1433 on that Docker container. And then there's a few environment variables. These are just variables that are used within that Docker container. And so as we go down here, there's a lot of definitions for spinning up an XP 9.3 instance. One thing to note is that this does not spin up an identity server for your 9.3 instance. At least the ones defined out of the box do not. So in the later video, I'll probably talk a little bit more about identity server and how to get that spun up as well if you want to do testing. Anyways, so the main things I want to talk about is the CD and the CM. These are your CM server and your CD server. In the world of Docker, this is your CD Docker container and your CM Docker container. So what I want to do next is I want to move those data folders over, or the data folders definitions that we basically need to move over. So to do that, what we just need to do, there's a few things that we're going to need to know here or define here, because one, these data folders, if you don't make it so they're part of source control, when the Docker container tries to, or the DockerCompose process tries to create those folders, it's going to basically throw errors, or at least that's the experience I've had. So I typically try to make sure that these exist, and I use basically a git keep file to make sure that they always are present. So let's go ahead and kind of navigate over to our Docker folder, Sitecore Docker Images, Windows, we're going to go to tests and 9.3x, and we're going to copy this folder as well. We're going to move this into development where our solution now exists, Docker training, and we're just going to place it here in the root. And this now kind of corresponds to, if we go back to this DockerCompose file, it kind of corresponds with actually they're not present right now, but there's a few in here. Data, this .data represents the root. It's going to go back to the root. It's going to find the location of this file, which is sitting in the root, and it's going to go to that file, and then it's going to look for this data folder, which currently doesn't exist until I just pasted it just now. As a part of that Sitecore Docker Images solution, they already have most of these .keeps in here, git keeps. So we don't need to necessarily worry about defining these. We just need to now know that this is in here. One other thing I want to move in here is the clean data.ps1 file, also defined in that Sitecore Docker Images repository. So I'll click back a few times because I needed to go back to that folder. And I'm going to steal this clean data. The clean data basically goes through your data folders, and it just cleans out data that might be there. When you run a DockerCompose, it just places a bunch of files there, and you might need to clean it out every once in a while, especially as you're doing local development. You might find that you might need to clean that stuff out. So I am going to then go back to Sitecore Docker Trainer, and I'm just going to place this in the root as well. All right, so now we've got our data folder there. One other folder I want to create is called a deploy folder, and I will kind of walk through what this is, but essentially we need a place where when we publish our solution file,
or essentially publish our projects and the assets that are part of that solution or a part of those projects, it needs to drop it in a folder, and essentially then there will be a link kind of between that folder and what's in our Docker container. Just name this real quick. We are going to drop this into the source folder, or SRC, in our Docker container. And essentially, it's kind of a trickery thing, and if you've read Mark Cassidy's post, he's talked about this a little bit, is what we're trying to achieve is when you deploy your assets from your solution or your projects and things that are in this Docker training solution that we're creating, we want to get those into our WW root for the CD instance as well as the CM instance. Now, we can't do that directly just because of limitations with Docker. So what we do is essentially we will create a volume. A volume, like I said, is just a map between a folder where we're going to publish these files to on our local machine. And then that's going to move that data automatically, or basically it's like a mirror image of what it looks like in our Docker container. So it's whatever's in that folder is going to exist in our Docker container in the C source folder, and then or SRC. And then there's going to be a script that actually is already part of the Sitecore Docker Images repository that they're providing that contains the scripts that will automatically do a robocopy from that source folder into our WW root folder. So that's already taken care of. So all we have to do is just get it, just kind of, first we're going to have to configure the volumes that we need for this, the deploys. And then we're going to need to configure our solution so it deploys these files to these deploy folders. So we'll start with the first. So we're going to basically want our CD to have a volume. So as of right now, they don't have any volumes. So we're just going to go ahead and define some volumes here. And so this will be a deploy folder. And we'll just call it website. And then when we do a colon here, this then represents, now we're defining what it is on that container. So we're just going to say, deploy / website deploys to C source. And what we're going to do is all our projects in here are all going to publish to deploy website. And I'll show how to define that here in a second. Let's just continue on with the CM. Again, there's no volumes already defined. You can define more than one volume. Like I said, I'm going to need to define now a volume for our CM instance. And this is going to basically be the same. Deploy website C source. So now our volume, so when we spin up our Docker using DockerCompose, this will all be set up and ready to go. One other thing I need to do is I need to go into our Docker deploy, and I need to create that website. And I want to go in here and I want to create a text file that is .getKeep. I've had this problem before. You can't name it like that. So what I do is typically I just steal one from here. Basically what I'm saying here is I want this folder to be in source control. And that way when a new developer pulls this repository down, this file or this folder is actually going to already exist. And that's what we want, because if it doesn't exist and then we go through a Docker create process or a Docker compose process, it's going to basically throw an error saying that this folder doesn't exist. And we don't want that. We don't want the developer to have to go through that manual process of creating that folder. So I think we're good on that perspective. I think the next step I want to go through is creating our published profiles. So this is a really simple process, and it's kind of a two-step process. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a publishing targets definition file that would be pulled into all our publishing definitions. So that way we only need to configure the location of this once, and then if it ever needs to change, we don't need to go back and redo it multiple times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a new item, And I'm not going to give it any specific type, but I will call this publish settings website debug targets. I'm giving it a name specifically because website is specific to the website definitions we want. If we had Xconnect, like I said, we might have an Xconnect debug targets definition file to specify where those projects might publish stuff to. I'm also specifying the build configuration of debug because we might want to have this be a different path, or use even variables in our Azure DevOps deploy process or whatever build or release pipeline tools that you're using. So I'll just click add, and then we'll just, I'm just going to copy this from another script I have. And basically what this is saying is it's going to go up a certain number of levels and then deploy to a website folder. And this also allows you to have, if you wanted to, and isn't as important as it used to be. So when you're using this DockerCompose process in your solution, everybody's going to be using the same setup. So that's what's so beautiful about this. No longer do you have to worry about, developer A having a D drive and then all the things are in the D drive. So then you have to define a configuration for your solution that's completely separate than the one you have. So the way you kind of combated that a little bit in the past is you had these .user files that you could define. So I had this targets.user file that you could define that would have its own file. A .user file is typically not checked in, so then that way you could have your own publishing targets to your own Docker container location. So Docker is great with this because now you don't have to worry about that. But anyways, so I'll leave that as that. And then, so what I'm going to want to do is click publish. And I'm just going to select IIS, configure. I'm going to create a profile. I'm actually going to do a file system deploy anyway, so I can just do C. I don't want it to actually publish, so I'm just going to save it. And I'm going to rename this to be debug. And sometimes when you do this, it's actually not going to pick it up into this. So we're not going to worry about that for right now. So the next thing I want to do is I want to change some of the configuration here. Essentially, this publish URL is going to now use this publishing targets that we previously used. So what I want to do is I'm just going to copy some code from another script here, and I'll just talk about it real quick. So this is essentially what we need. So it's just going to pull in this import of our targets file that we have, publish settings, website debug.targets. This, like I said, contains the publish URL. So this is the publish URL. This could also include additional exclude files from deployment. So if you wanted to exclude additional files, it's now easier to define because it's all up in one location. You can define it for all the solutions that you have, and you would go through this similar process every time you create a new module for your solution. You could actually copy this file and just place it into the next module that you define. And then all these settings are kind of generic. And that's pretty much it. So I'll save that. And one thing I need to do is I need to unload this project and reload it, because it's not going to pick up the publishing profile until I do that. So now it's showing debug, which basically represents our publishing thing. So something that's quick that we can just do to test is we can just do a publish here. And what we should find is if we go to our file system, is if we go to this deploy folder website, we now see all the files that we would expect here. So the views contains our demo layout, and our bin now contains all the files that we need from the Sitecore's perspective, as well as the DLLs from that module. So we're in a good spot. So now I think the next step is going through our DockerCompose process. So to do that, we're going to go back to our file system, and this process is really relatively simple. All we need to do is change into our directory. So we'll do cd Sitecore Docker Container, training. And now that we're there, we'll just view the files real quick. And basically, we just want to do a DockerCompose. What's great is if we name it just docker-compose.yaml, we don't have to specify the file. So typically, from the last series, what you would see me do is specify a file, and we'd specify, dockercompose.xp.yaml, for example, and then specify out. But we don't need to do that. We just need to do Docker Compose up. And so if we run that, it will basically spin up our Docker containers, and it will actually use the files that we. So let's go ahead and do that and see where we're at. So Docker Compose. Give it a few seconds as it tries to. It looks like I misspelled something, which is figures with me. So let's open up that Docker Compose file, and it should be volumes, not volume. Just make sure I did it right there. So we're good. Let's go ahead and run it again. So now it's going through the process of creating the network for our Docker containers that we're spinning up, and then it should here shortly just go through the process of spinning up a 9.3 instance. All right, so now we're able to see that our Docker Compose has succeeded, because essentially it's running all these Solar commands over and over again. I did have some problems when I was running this. My license file was not correct, so I just had to make sure that was mapped correctly in my environments.env file, and then everything was working correctly thereafter. So that's just something that you need to make sure that everything is good to go. So once we're done, what we're going to do is we're going to reference this file, and I'm going to just make sure that on the CM side that I'm able to access that. So I should be able to hit 4401. If I copy that real quick, and I bring over a browser window, and basically HTTPS, or HTTP, it's not HTTPS. If you want to learn how to set up HTTPS, you can watch a video by Michael West. And then essentially the port number, and then I can just hit enter. And then after a short period of time, this should load up. All right, so once it loaded, we actually see an error. So this is actually, I know what causes this error. This is something I forgot to do. So if we go back and we go into manage the Nougat packages for this module that we defined, manage Nougat packages, we will see that we're using the latest version of .NET MVC. We should not be using that. We should be using 5.2.4. So to do that, all we need to do is update these to use 5.2.4 instead. And that kind of proves that what we were publishing into that deploy folder is working accurately. There's two options we have. We can just update it and publish it, which is what we're going to do here. That should fix the error. Or we could actually Docker Compose down and then fix the issue and then deploy it up. So you can blow up your environment and then fix it by making some changes, and you don't have to worry about having to spend hours now or whatever it was before to turn down your existing instance. If you blow it up like you do now, you just Docker Compose down, Docker Compose up, and you're back up and running relatively quickly. So we'll just go through these steps real quick. And that, I think, is it. So now we will just do another publish here real quick. And then we will go to our browser, which we were in. Refresh. Give it a couple more seconds, minutes, potentially, for it to respin back up, since we just put in some new DLLs to this. All right, as you can see, the site has loaded. So what this represents is that we're basically, as we're publishing changes to that deploy folder that we previously set up, we're actually affecting our container. So now if we wanted to, we could just tear it down, or now we could start adding additional projects or
either projects or modules at the feature layer or at the foundation layer, and we can start essentially building out our website. So this concludes today's video. Stay tuned next week. Hopefully on Wednesday, I'll be releasing how to set up Unicorn with this process, so that you can start making changes inside your containers, inside essentially Sitecore itself, to start configuring templates and other things. And then from there, I'm probably going to do various other small segments about topics, such as one on how to set up TDS with this process, as well as a video on how to debug a solution that you're working on that's running in the container. All right, I hope you have learned a lot from this series. Check out the link below with details about the GitHub repo, as well as take a link back to the video that I previously created about how to set up all Sitecore Docker images. And please subscribe if you are interested in hearing more about these Docker content pieces or other Sitecore content that I'm creating pretty actively, I hope, this year. If you like this, if this helped you along this process, please like this video. That goes a long way to helping me reach out to other people searching for various similar topics. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.